Once upon a time, in the 14th century, England and France just couldn't get along. It was like that never-ending neighborhood rivalry only. Instead of fighting over whose fence was on whose lawn, they were fighting over the entire thrones of both countries. And so began the 100 Years' War that actually lasted 116 years. That's right, even the name is wrong. The whole thing kicked off in 1337. Why? Because of one thing, a big complicated claim to the throne of France. England's King Edward III believed he had the right to be the King of France, not just because he was Edward III, a guy with a big ego, but because his mother was actually a French princess. Edward had a strong claim, but there was just one tiny problem. The French nobles didn't agree. They looked at Edward, looked back at each other, and said, "No, we're good. We're going to crown someone else." So France went with a man named Philip VI, and that did not sit well with Edward. "Oh, you don't think I'm the rightful king?" He might have said. "Fine, we'll settle this the old-fashioned way, with swords, horses, and a lot of yelling." And that's how two of Europe's most powerful nations plunged into a conflict that would span a century and a bit. Spoiler alert, Edward didn't get what he wanted, but that didn't stop him from trying. Phase 1. The English mean business. Edward started out with a bang. He assembled an army, crossed the channel, and started raiding French towns like he was shopping in a mall. The English soldiers were fearless, bold, and deadly accurate with a weapon called the longbow. Now, the longbow was the hot new thing in warfare. Picture it, French knights, covered head to toe in shiny armor, charging on horseback. And then there were the English archers peasants, mostly who could shoot from a long way off, making those fancy knights look like armored porcupines. Not a great look. The English scored a big win at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. Imagine it, the French knights charging up the hill shouting, probably thinking, "We're going to crush these guys." Meanwhile, the English archers are waiting, cool as cucumbers, fingers on the bowstrings. And then, whoosh! Hundreds of arrows flew, raining down on the French. It was a disaster for France. And let's not forget Edward's son, the Black Prince, who was just a teenager but fought like a warrior. He was decked out in black armor, earning him that ominous nickname. The Black Prince was the medieval version of a rock star. After Crécy, Edward laid siege to the city of Calais. He wanted it as an entry point into France, and after a whole year of toughing it out, the people of Calais surrendered. And just like that, England had a foothold in France. Phase 2. The Black Death decides to drop in. But just when things were heating up, in comes the Black Death. Yes, because what's a medieval war without a plague? The Black Death swept through Europe in the 1340s, killing millions of people. It was like nature's own terrible timeout for everyone. Soldiers, civilians, kings, no one was safe. This awful disease didn't care if you were English, French, noble, or poor. It wiped out entire villages, crushed armies, and pretty much forced everyone to take a step back from fighting. When the dust, and sadly a lot of people, settled, both countries were devastated. The war took a pause because honestly, there just weren't enough people left to fight. Phase 3. The war gets personal again. After the plague, both sides took a breather. But not for long. By the time the Black Prince was an adult, he picked up right where his father left off. He led the English to another major victory at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. It was like Crécy all over again, but this time they even managed to capture the King of France, John II. Yep, the English had their rival's king as a prisoner. It was an embarrassing situation for France, and an expensive one too. England demanded a huge ransom for King John's release, which was a classic medieval move. "We've got your king, hand over the cash." France paid up, but the war was nowhere near over. If anything, it just kept going and going like a soap opera, but with more armor and horses. Phase 4. A girl named Joan steps up. Fast forward a bit to the early 1400s, and things aren't looking good for France. The English had gained more ground, and the French people were tired. The kingdom was divided, and morale was at rock bottom. Enter Joan of Arc. Now, Joan wasn't your typical medieval warrior. She was a teenage peasant girl, and she claimed that she heard voices of saints. She said that told her to drive the English out and put the rightful king of France on the throne. At first, no one took her seriously. A teenage girl leading an army? In the 1400s? It sounded absurd. But she was persistent, and eventually, she got an audience with Charles, the Dauphin, or French prince. She convinced him to let her lead an army to the city of Orleans, which was under siege by the English. And to everyone's surprise, she won. Joan's victory at Orleans was nothing short of miraculous. She inspired the French like nothing else could. People believed that she was sent by God, and this renewed faith in the French cause spread like wildfire. Suddenly, France had hope, and the English were on the back foot. Joan's capture and the end of the war. Joan's success didn't last forever. She was eventually captured by the English and put on trial for heresy. They called her a witch, a liar, and everything else they could think of. In the end, they burned her at the stake. But her death only strengthened the French cause. Joan became a martyr, a symbol of French resistance. Her legacy fired up the French, giving them the courage to keep fighting. Finally, after decades of bloodshed, France began to push the English back. The tide turned in favor of France, and by 1453, the English had lost almost all their territories in France, except for Calais. The 100 Years' War was over. The end? Or was it? The war technically ended with no official treaty. They just sort of stopped fighting. England and France went their separate ways, exhausted, broke, and wondering what they'd been fighting over for all those years. France regained its land, and England was left to lick its wounds. The 100 Years' War left a huge mark on both countries. It changed the way wars were fought, with a shift away from heavily armored knights to a new era of foot soldiers and archers. And though it was a time of tragedy and hardship, it also created legends like the Black Prince and Joan of Arc, whose stories have lived on for centuries. In the end, this wasn't just a war over a throne. It was a fight over pride, power, and history itself. England and France would keep their rivalry going in one way or another. But one thing was clear. The 100 Years' War had redefined what it meant to be English and what it meant to be French. And as for who really won, well, that's for the historians to argue over. But if you ask me, the real winner was the longbow,